Most of you will hopefully be familiar with Andrew. We did an episode with Andrew a little while back, and I should have made a note of the episode number, but I'm sure you'll know it.
263.
263. Thank you. Thank you. Episode 263, and Matthew's already chipped in as well. Episode 263, where we talked about Andrew's series of books about Cold War Berlin. So today, what Andrew's going to be doing is he's going to be talking about the books that he is working on, books he's got coming up, but also the techniques that he uses to research the books and create some of the content. But we welcome any questions you've got for Andrew about the books, or any general question about the Cold War. We can try and answer that as well. But I'm going to hand you over to Andrew, and he will kick off. So over to you, mate.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon and good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. No, it's very good to be here. I'd like to talk for a few minutes on how and why I came to write my books about the Cold War. And as Ian said, I was very happy to do an episode on the wonderful Cold War Conversations podcast on the building of the Berlin Wall. I'm sure we'll get to do some more episodes. There's so much to talk about, and it's just so many good stories. And as keeping the Cold War, just saving that history, which is what it's all about. So let's just kick off and just give you a little bit of background. I'm an author specialising in the Cold War, which of course makes me very, very much at home with the Cold War Conversations podcast. I've had 3 books published so far. Excuse me. The Secrets of the Cold War, you can see on the left there, is published. That was published by Pen and Sword at the end of last year. So it's very much a new product, new book on the shelf. And there's also the first 2 volumes in a mini series on Cold War Berlin that I'm writing for Helion. And there you have a sneak preview of volume 3, which is coming out next month. The cover's not quite right, but it gives you the general look and feel of what the cover's going to look like. I'm going to talk about mostly Secrets of the Cold War during this talk, but I'm not going into too much detail about the individual stories. It's one of those things that you're going to have to read buy the book to get the full story. But think of this as the sort of the making of, or the bonus content you find on the DVDs or the Blu-rays. I'm going to try and give you a bit of background as to the what I do when I'm putting my books together, which might be of interest to you all. We shall see. So, am I a historian? Well, I'll be honest, I have to admit that I'm entirely self-taught. I actually gave up studying history after the 3rd year at school. Now, that might not translate to other countries, but it's about the age of 14. I just wasn't interested back when I was that young. But as I've become older and wiser, I've become quite a history fan, and I've consumed enough historical non-fiction to know what's required, and I'm a quick learner. But I think it's the techniques that people would train a historian on. I've picked up most of the techniques. The writing part has come fairly easily. As I spent decades writing marketing copy in my previous career, adverts, literature, packaging, whatever. So I simply needed to convert it to a more long form approach. It's been commented on that my writing style's fairly informal, but that works for me. It's all about trying to have a good head for detail, trying to explain complicated and nuanced situations, but in a achievable format that's hopefully easy to read and enjoyable to read. Packed with facts, but presented in a useful format. So in terms of research, well, I started out realizing, this was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I started out realizing I didn't know very much about the Cold War. So I began reading up on it. Working with a local museum, I began to sort of write up my research. And then it dawned on me that I could sort of turn these notes into a book. So I ended up in a supermarket cafe on a cold Friday afternoon in November 2019, pitching my ideas to a couple of publishers. And I was somewhat surprised that both of them said yes. Next thing I know, I've been commissioned to write 7 books. So we published 3. 2 will be out this year, and there's a load more in the pipeline. In terms of research, my library is ever growing. Actually, it's quite a lot of the speakers on the Cold War Conversation podcasts. I enjoy the podcast, and I go out and buy the book, and that really has broadened my knowledge. It's really good. So as well as the books, my local library has been absolutely fantastic. They will generally buy me a copy of a book if it's not on their in their stock, and I obviously spent hours and hours picking through the internet. One thing though, I've built up a network of expert contacts all around the world who are exceedingly generous with their time. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at how friendly the Cold War community is, the Cold War history community is. But I've been given a huge amount of information with no expectation of return. So I live in the far southwest of the United Kingdom, long way from London, which is where most of the archives are kept. I've made several research trips up country, as we say down here, but I'm lucky that the Americans are really good at digitizing their primary source material, so I can access an awful lot online. I wish the same could be said about the British, but we'll get there in the end. So, one thing I look for in my research is connections, how individuals and events are interconnected, and it's surprising how many links there are when you start to scratch the surface. I also think very visually, and that might be a legacy of my marketing days, but I tend to map out what I'm discovering, and it's this process plus the constant iteration of refining that reveals the patterns and the connections, and I find that absolutely fascinating. Just take this as an example. This is not the daubings of a demented historian. Perhaps it is, but this is about the 5th or 6th version of a mind map I pulled together a couple of years ago now, while I was writing the chapter in Secrets of the Cold War. And it's about the Rosenberg spy ring. I'm sure you will all know about the atomic spies, or know of them. The previous versions of this extended across 3 or 4 sheets of A3 paper, all taped together with lines and arrows and crossings out and notes and marked up in colour. I do tend to get through quite a lot of post-it notes and highlighter pens. But this helped me map out the relationships and the contacts, the personalities, and to a certain degree the flow of events. And this was accompanied by a huge Word document with detailed biographies I pulled together of all the individuals. And in Microsoft Word, you can hyperlink information around. So I use these hyperlinks to hardwire these connections into the document so I could fly around all over the place. And that helped me build the picture. The situation with spies is made, or certainly spies of this generation, was made much more complicated by the myriad of code words and code names used. And also, obviously, spies tended to have different code names throughout their career, which makes tracking them down all the more difficult. And also, they were changed for security reasons, or if that particular spy changed from KGB ownership, if you like, to GRU ownership. So trying to track all these names down and plot the story was quite difficult, but quite entertaining. So if this is the sort of the mad scribbles, well, that's how it ended up in the book. So you can see the sort of direct relationship between the mad daubings and how it appears on the page. So this shows us the Rosenberg ring, and then in the conclusion of the book, I take the same diagram, but I annotate it to show the fates of the individual participants, if you like. So yeah, that visual approach to writing is quite important for me. There are other clusters that started to appear as well. So again, I had elaborate drawings for them that have congealed into this summary of the different connections between the perpetrators. And that, it makes patterns, and that gives me background that I can talk about. One thing I was astounded with was how extensive Stalin's espionage network was, and how his spies got their claws into virtually every aspect of American and British society. It was a masterstroke, to be honest, of intelligence gathering. And here's just one particular chart I pulled together to just try and plot how he went about it. Inevitably, the process required me to understand the history of Soviet intelligence, and that also proved a challenge. Basically, his agencies changed their name every 5 minutes, it seems, as, I guess, different trends, sort of purges went in, went out, reorganizations, I don't know. But he also introduced this conflict into his intelligence services, which is a strange approach that was very Soviet, where rival agencies competed for his patronage. The KGB was the natural successor to the Cheka, and here you can see its progression. This is another diagram from the book, and the GRU was his military one. So this created a competition and rivalry with the rival services squabbling over who owned a particular agent or a target or a territory. And I know that the KGB would normally claim seniority, but I'm not sure it actually worked that way in the field. It also, the approach adopted ensured that his spy masters and agents were always looking over their shoulders, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it also created redundancy, which was quite useful when Stalin was on one of his purges and got rid of a whole raft of agents or managers, if you like, or when a particular network was rolled up, which I describe in the book. For example, after the end of the Second World War, when the Venona decrypts basically collapsed the whole KGB structure within the US, but the GRU was there in the background, able to keep things moving forward. So this was quite interesting. I mean, it's an example of one of the rabbit holes that I frequently go down. I take a look on a particular subject and I sort of veer off into a tangent, which can be time consuming, but it normally yields results. So the Soviet intelligence history was quite an interesting example. But I studied Marxism. I decided I needed to understand the Soviet mentality, and I sort of just looked at Marx, Engels, back to Hegel, and people like that, and how that then got taken on by Lenin, and then Marxism, Leninism, and so on and so on. And that gave us perhaps a glimpse of the Soviet mentality, but also the motivation for some of the spies. I thought it was very important to learn about the Manhattan Project itself, and that was really fascinating. I learned a lot by doing that. I even tried to get my head around some of the physics. I gave up physics at the same time as I gave up history, but the technologies to understand how the bomb was built, but also the roles that the different people played within the Manhattan Project and why that was of interest to the Soviets. So this whole story, this is the whole first chapter in the book, extraordinary tale of science, technology, industrial power, and espionage, and it's really pivotal to the emergence of the Cold War. So I very much enjoyed writing that. So, am I a geographer? So I've asked the question, am I a historian? Well, am I a geographer as well? Maps are really important in my writing. whether it's some seismic geopolitical event or just to spot a local bother. Unfortunately, my skills don't extend to cartography yet, but I'm lucky that I work with a lot of people who can help me on this front. It took studying a map to realise, with the benefit of hindsight, just how obvious Stalin's grand plan was to create this buffer zone between Mother Russia and the imperialist West. So here's a map of how Europe looked in 1938, before the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, start of the Second World War, and Hitler's disastrous attempt to fight the war on two fronts. Stalin was paranoid, probably with some justification, that the West had designs on his huge resources and open spaces in the Soviet Union. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, I'm sure you all know, was a cynical attempt to buy some time, but Hitler's betrayal of that pact in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa pushed Stalin to the edge of disaster. And I didn't realise, I had to look this up yesterday, the Wehrmacht got within about 12 miles of Moscow before they ran out of steam, and the rest is, as we say, history. But all this fueled Stalin's paranoia further. But it's not until you look at the same map, less than a decade later, you can see the epic scale, the brilliance, if you like, of this plan. So he created this ring of steel that subsequently became known as the Iron Curtain, and that became the front line in the Cold War. But you compare that to the borders of the original Soviet Union back in 1938, and you get to see just the sort of the geopolitical scale of his influence. So basically taking control of all these Eastern Bloc countries under his patronage is perhaps one word, but it just gives you an idea of the sort of geopolitical nature of it all. And really only by looking at maps you can appreciate just how comprehensive that strategy was. So I'm constantly referring to maps when I'm writing, in books or on the walls in my office. I've got a big map of East Germany over there for my current project, which I'll talk about in a minute, or Google Maps. Google Maps is extraordinary, very useful tool, and I include as many as I can. And these are just 5 or so examples of the maps that appear in my work, and they really help to bring the narrative to life. That's the whole point of doing this. And they're not just in black and white. So I've got colour maps as well in my work. And also I've been able, thanks mainly to the various US archives, to get some really good maps produced by the CIA and by the US military in colour as well, which is quite good. So we talked about, am I a historian? Am I a geographer? Well, am I an archaeologist? It turns out that I'm a conflict archaeologist. I didn't realise I was until I spoke to a real conflict archaeologist, a PhD student who's been doing some work with bricksmiths. And I realised that I was pretty much doing the same as she was, without the training and the fancy terminology, if you like. As I research a subject, I try to understand everything about it, including recreating the scene in my mind, what's going on, sketches, diagrams, and that sort of stuff. And I realised this is a great way of getting across the story to the reader, much better than just prose. So a case in point is the story of the Portland Spies, and I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this story. Major spy scandal from the 1960s, 1960 even. So we have Harry Horton and his girlfriend Ethel G. They were supplying secrets from their employers at the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment in Portland, Dorset, as opposed to Portland, Oregon. They were supplying them to their Soviet handler, Gordon Lonsdale, and then he would regularly visit a New Zealand couple, Peter and Helen Kroger, at their bungalow in Ruislip, in London, or West London. And obviously the British viewers today might be familiar with Ruislip, but for people outside the UK, Ruislip is a very dull backwater suburb. It's commuter land, but it has a reputation, I think, for being quite a sort of not particularly exciting place. But that's probably why they chose it, as we'll soon see. So Lonsdale was in reality Conan Molody. He was a long-term Soviet sleeper agent. And the Krogers weren't actually the Krogers. They were Lona and Morris Cohen. They're Americans, and they were his couriers. So as the net closed in on them, a chance discovery resulted in Special Branch and MI5 setting up an observation point in a house opposite. 45 Cranley Drive was the bungalow in Ruislip, and a surveillance operation began that resulted in the arrest of Lonsdale, Houghton and G in London, and a dramatic raid on the Kroger's bungalow. So what I tried to do was understand why Ruislip. Well, again, it's a place where they're not likely to be noticed, and the location of the bungalow. And I tried to recreate the scene in my head. Why was it such a good base for espionage? So Google Maps, good old Google. So the first stage of this process is always to look at it in this format as a map, and then you can look at the satellite, thankfully, and that's the position of the observation point across the road. And obviously what you can see here, the first thing you can see is that there was obviously a back escape route across this sports ground. And Cranley Drive here, you can see, is actually a dead end, although there's an alleyway there. So it's actually quite an interesting, well-chosen spot for a clandestine operation. So then I go from the satellite view to street view, and there we have the bungalow, which was quite a thrill finding that. I mean, it's obvious that it's there, but just the fact that I could click around on Google Maps and explore the scene of some pretty major espionage was quite fun. And and if you're in any doubt, there's the original bungalow. Looks as though they've had a bit of work, changed the roof line and got rid of some chimneys, but that's the bungalow. So that was the bungalow. There was the house opposite, Mr. and Mrs. Search in that house, and the OP was run from one of those upstairs bedrooms. There's the alleyway, and that alleyway was used by Lonsdale to go back and forth from where he parked his car, which was here, and there you see the bungalow. Sorry, the alleyway, and this helps me understand really what's going on.
Drew, I'm not sure that the slide has moved on. I'm still looking at the bungalow currently. There you go. That's great. Oh,
yeah. You happy with that?
Go back to the map.
Okay, so you've got
go back.
That's the alleyway, and then that's
great.
Cool. Yeah, and so basically this is how it ended up in the book. So you've got the bungalow, you've got the alleyway, you've got where he parked his car, and again, if you know the story, he had a Studebaker, a really fancy American import car, which really wasn't probably the most sensible thing to do for a guy trying to operate a covert operation. But anyway, that's history. And there's the house for the OP. So just that little exercise really helped me understand what was going on and how Lonsdale operated with the Krogers, and the benefits of why they based themselves where they did, and then the operation that was used to observe them and then grab them. So there you go. Here are a couple of other reconstructions I pulled together. My homemade archaeology. So the one on the left there is the detailed flight schematic of the Berlin airlift. And as you can see, at its height, it was an extremely complicated operation, and that shows the different air traffic control mechanisms used to control the routes in. Quick slurp of coffee. And on the right there, Checkpoint Bravo in Berlin, which is obviously the link, the entrance to Berlin, to West Berlin, which links up with the road corridor going to Helmstedt and West Germany. Now, I didn't realise that the Checkpoint Bravo, Baker, as it originally was, moved, and it moved from the position down on the canal up to by the checkpoint, and there was the whole story around why it had to move. But I just did some research into the geography, and you can understand from photographs and from contemporary maps what was going on, and I recreated it on this map here. And then lastly, here's a recreation of the Checkpoint Charlie confrontation in October '61 between the Americans and Soviets. I wanted to try and understand how close the Soviets were from the two sides were from each other, where some of the other vehicles were standing off, if you like. So the famous scene, as seen on the left here, was one aspect of it. But as you can see, there was tanks positioned all along the Friedrichstrasse, Zimmerstrasse section there. So again, another sort of recreation, all to help me understand what's going on, and therefore the reader to pass the information to them. So it turns out I was a conflict archaeologist all along and didn't know it, with apologies to any real conflict archaeologists out there. So, but there you go. So, am I a graphic artist? Well, again, in my former career as a marketing man, I commissioned thousands of pieces of artwork, but I always got other people to do it for me. So in my new career as a non-fiction author, I can't call on people to do that work for me. So I've had to reinvent myself as a bit of a graphic artist. I never got around to learning Illustrator or Photoshop. My chosen weapon is PowerPoint, would you believe? But I've got quite creative about how I can use PowerPoint. So again, you've probably seen that I think very visually. Well, similarly, I like to create graphics that get the message across. So, oops, sorry, a bit fast there. So here's one example. This is a recreation of the infamous death strip, and this is all produced in PowerPoint, would you believe? And here we have a series of schematics showing the configuration of the famous Berlin Tunnel that the CIA and SIS tapped in the 1950s to get the Soviet telephone calls. Again, I wanted to try and understand the geography, even the engineering side of the project, and I pulled together these schematics to help me understand it. And helped
Andrew, I'm not sure we can see the schematic at the moment of the Berlin Tunnel.
What can you see now?
I'm looking at the death strip.
Okay, that's really weird.
Yeah, no, I can see it now. Great. Don't know why there's a delay, but anyway, yeah, we're good. Yeah, we can see it.
There's a strange lag between what I'm seeing on my screen and what you guys are seeing. So anyway,
it may be me actually, because Thomas has commented that there's no delay. So I'll just shut up. Okay.
Yeah, shut up. Anyway, so I had the original CIA reports, and I had photos from the Soviets took when they discovered it in 1956, and I had a few photos, not very good ones, from the CIA, and I just basically recreated it in my own mind and created these graphics. And I really think it helps me understand what's going on. And here's another one. This is a simulated release of a nuclear weapon from a Soviet Su-17 fighter jet. And this is using the LABS, the Labs Low Altitude Bombing System technique. And this was a recreation of a sketch made by a Bricksmith tour officer in September 1971. And he was able to, as you can see here down on the left, he was able to sort of sit and observe this attack profile, and he sketched it all out and then worked it all out. The even the time difference between the sound, the speed of sound and all that sort of stuff. And I've recreated the graphic here for use in the book. So I think visually as well as in words, basically. But speaking of visuals, a lot of time and effort is spent on researching images to use in the books. So maps and graphics are one thing, but images are very important to non-fiction, as I'm sure you will all appreciate. What you may not realise, though, is that most authors are responsible for sourcing all their own images. So unless you're a Max Hastings or a Ben McIntyre, bringing in the big bucks, they've probably got picture editors working for them, or they have access to Getty or Alamy or one of these big picture libraries. But unfortunately, the costs of those sorts of services are well beyond us mere mortals. So we have to rely on our own search skills and the incredible generosity of these enthusiasts around the world that I've mentioned. And they're prepared to share images from their personal collections to help struggling authors like myself. So just a selection of images. But the process of researching images, making sure you've got the rights to use them, is a very time-consuming task. Sometimes it's a bit soul-destroying, but then you find yourself a gem of an image, like some of these ones here, and that makes up for the the pain. But also, it's sometimes down to luck. So again, I think probably the audience today is well familiar with the story of Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne, his hapless courier, recruited by MI6 to look after the Soviet spy, as depicted by Benedict Cumberbatch in the 2020 film The Courier. A little inset there of him. Wynne often entertained Penkovsky and members of his delegation and all sorts of interesting characters at his home in Upper Chain Row in Chelsea. That's London. So there's a story about I relate in the book that's quite a well-known one, that both Wynne and Penkovsky got together and they both put a claim to their respective spy masters. So SIS in the case of Wynne, GRU in the case of Penkovsky, to put a bar in Greville Wynne's house to facilitate entertaining contacts, if you like. More like entertaining themselves, but that was the ruse they did. Both spy agencies coughed up their 500 quid each, so they had £1,000, which was an awful lot in 1960 or whenever it was, and there's more enough than to build the bar, but also to spend a load of money on booze and other fast living, shall we say. So clicking around doing my research, I stumbled on a 2015 article in the Guardian newspaper about the sale of 19 Upper Chain Row. It was up for £6 million, which is quite a lot for a house anyway, and how it had retained a lot of its original features. And just clicking through the article, I saw the bar. And as you can see in the image here, it's clearly the original bar that was built back in the day. So I contacted the estate agent who was selling the property, and they sort of looked back in their records. They put me in touch with the photographer, who gave me permission to use the image, which I've included in the book. And all he wanted in return was a copy of the book for himself and a credit. So sometimes it's quite nice to you just stumble on a lucky break, if you like. So am I an artist? Well, actually, no, I'm not an artist. I've got no artistic talent as such, even though I spent years working in the artist material industry. But anyway, that's another story. But there are lots of great artists out there. So in my Hellion books in particular, we use a lot of colour illustrations to support the text. So we've got a network of artists all over the world who pull these together. These are mostly digitally created. The image, this little selection here is produced by guys in Austria, in Italy, and even Bosnia-Herzegovina, would you believe? And so we've got, these really very nice and very carefully researched sort of original images that are used in the books. The vehicles tend to come from a guy in France who's very well versed in these vehicles, and the soldier illustrations we use in the books, they come from artists in Brazil, would you believe? Rather than produced digitally, these are actually produced with pencil and watercolor and gouache, and they're actually painted and then scanned and sent across. Amazing results. I'm absolutely, love seeing these images come together. So whether it's an aircraft, a vehicle, a uniform, or even the insignia you see down the bottom, every aspect of it's very carefully researched, because basically we want to make sure it's authentic. And it's down to every buckle, every button, belt, pocket, pouch, holster, weapon, all the details we really sort of pick over. Because in some cases, we can actually establish a link with the people who's in the image, and I know a lot of veterans also read the books, and I think it's out of respect to them that we spend a lot of time on accuracy. So these are great fun to put together. So, what's up next? What am I working on at the moment? I've got a long list of projects in the pipeline, and that's going to keep me busy for years. And I'm chuffed to bits that I can spend my time doing this work. As I mentioned, Volume 3 in the Cold War Berlin miniseries for Hellion will be out next month. It's the Volume 3 and 4 are both on the US garrison in Berlin. And so the Volume 3, the first of the pair, if you like, that comes out next month. The second will be out later this year. I've finished it. It's just they're going to schedule it in later in the year. And then I've got another half dozen or so titles in the series that's lined up. But the project I'm working on at the moment is the first of two commissions on Brixmis, the British mission to the Soviet forces in Germany. This is for Pen and Sword, and I know Brixmis is a favourite topic of the Cold War Conversations audience. The first is a history of the unit and the story of their adventures and all sorts of exciting stuff, gathering intelligence inside the former East Germany, and that will be out next year. And the others are to come down the line. So that is enough of me waffling away. Thank you for listening. Just wanted to say that the nice people at Pen and Sword have given you guys a special discount code if you wanted to pick up a copy of Secrets of the Cold War. If you use that code, and Ian said he's going to pop it in the emails and show notes or whatever, but that's a good price off the RRP, and that's valid until the 3rd of April. So if you want to go ahead, by all means, that's very nice of them to do that. They're fans of the podcast too, so that's good. So that's it from me for presenting stuff. But if there's stuff that you want to ask me about, I'm all ears.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Really fascinating insight into the creative process there, and I never knew that PowerPoint could be used so well. So,
well, nor did I until I tried.
Yeah, and I love the story of Greville-Wynn's bar. Actually, I love the fact they managed to charge both intelligence services for that. But anyway, less from me. People who have questions, if you want to ask it in person, there should be an option to do that. But if you want to ask it via chat, then feel free to put your question in the chat, and Andrew will answer that whilst people are gathering their thoughts there. Andrew, one of the things that always intrigues me, and you sort of touched on it, is sourcing these photos. So are there a number of sort of like free libraries that you can use for this sort of stuff?
The US National Archives are really good for this type of thing. The quality of the images online is just about good enough for use in publication. Some cases it's a bit marginal, but you can apply to have high-res images sent, but that costs money, and sort of like £10 an image. When you think, I think there's something like 130 odd images in one of the Hellion books. You start paying £10 an image. That's like, I don't know how many years of royalty payments, if that. You completely wipe out any possible return on the book. So US National Archives are brilliant. Other places, the Allied Museum in Berlin, they've got a fantastic image resource. And in fact, there's a mob called Museums Digital Berlin, where all the different museums, not just the Allied Museum, but all the museums in Berlin have come together to create this digital sort of vault, if you like. But yeah, there are places like that you find. I've also got a chap in France who can help me with loads of images, and he's got links with Hanoi in Vietnam and the military museum there, and so therefore stuff that's Eastern Bloc related was shared quite freely amongst the sort of the communist world, if you like. And so he's supplied some remarkable images for me via, bizarrely, Hanoi and Paris. But yeah, you just got to really dig around, and every now and then you hit a gold seam and you're lucky, and other times you can be, banging your head against the screen. But yeah.
Wow. Well, you've almost got your own international intelligence service.
I have.
Sort of like the spider's web, where you're at the centre of it. Now, we have got a couple of questions. The first one's from Paul Nipras, and
hi, Paul.
It's which part of the Berlin story do you find intriguing, and why?
When I was the original research project, if you like, this is before I got as far as books, was the Cold War, and I wanted to try and understand what the Cold War was. And what happened was, almost every corner I turned in the research was a road leading to Berlin. And sort of Berlin is such a hub for the Cold War. I'm just reading Max Hastings' book that he came on the podcast about, The Abyss. I'm actually really enjoying the book. It's probably a lot easier to read than listen to the podcast, to be honest, because but he was very very entertaining on the podcast. But the book is really, really well written, that constantly refers to Berlin. It's a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Berlin's referred to almost on every other page. So I realised that Berlin was really very important to the Cold War, and that's really where this whole Iron City, Cold War Berlin idea came from. And the thing that I find, I think, most interesting about it is the epic scale of it. I suppose the huge industrial scale that the war became. It's not just a war that you're talking about, a massive hinterland and a ridiculous amount of technology, all designed to keep the population in rather than the enemies getting across. It's a remarkable thing. So I'm very much intrigued as to the epic scale of it, and also I think just the brutality of it as well. The fact that they felt it was necessary to do that to their people, and how that then links into the wider communist experiment, if you like, and perhaps why the people weren't that excited about what their glorious leaders wanted to do with their lives. So really, I think just the sort of scale of it, and I think I've talked about, when I went and saw the wall. I know Ian had a similar experience. You can't help but being a bit awestruck by it, just how sort of bleak and dismal and scary it was, really. So that's why I find that interesting.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I think that probably echoes a lot of our listeners' fascination with Berlin. As people notice, I'm always drawn back to another episode on Berlin or East Germany, but it's an endless subject that keeps giving. So we've also got a question from Matthew Comstock. So it's, have you uncovered anything in your research that goes against our conventional understanding of the Cold War? Maybe something that makes you rethink how you perceive a certain topic?
That's a good question. I think I'm constantly, obviously, I interpret what I see with my own eyes, and I write about it as I see it, if you like. I haven't had any silver bullets, any sort of like eureka moments, because the subject matter is pretty well covered. Now, we're not like the Second World War, or books about Hitler, or books about Spitfires that are all over the place. The Cold War is still, you could say, a fairly untapped market. So there is a lot to be said about, a lot to be told about the Cold War. I like to look at it in a certain way, and I've sort of described how I go about that. And I'm really observing it as I'm seeing it. I don't have an agenda, really, apart from just trying to tell what is a very interesting story. And then all throughout it, I'm learning new things. And I suppose because I've got a library a bit like Ian's library behind him there, but I'm finding stuff that I haven't come across before all the time. So if I haven't come across it, and I'm not saying that I am the oracle of all knowledge, but it's a fair bet that I'm reasonably well read on the subject, and if it's new to me, well, hopefully it'll be new to the people who are buying my books. So yeah, I can't think of a particular nugget apart from perhaps the Greville wins bar, but anyway, yeah, no, I can't think of anything really that's screaming at me. But just the whole approach I'm trying to take is tell the story in a way that is very presentable and accessible.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And if people have got any other questions, do post them in the comments. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying there, Andrew, because I think for me, it's the little details that get teased out of conversations with people that I find fascinating. And that's probably one of the biggest pleasures that I get out of doing the podcast, is hearing somebody describe something and just not having no realization that that was the situation, or that's how they understood the situation, or how they felt at that moment in time. Things that are a little bit more visceral than a fact, or a politician's viewpoint.
I think some of the stuff I talk about in the books is quite operational, and it's not necessarily well understood, the machinations, the infrastructure that needed to go into maintaining this. In the case of the Berlin books, maintaining that island city, the stuff that had to go on in the background to make it happen. So, for example, this new book coming out, Volume 3, understanding how do you run a garrison of American soldiers where you are had to be completely self-sufficient, and so therefore it's very unlike any other military unit because it is so unusual, and how they go about running it and how they go about maintaining the peace. That's the whole aspect of Volume 3, and Volume 4 is about how they went about preparing for war. And what's so unusual about the Berlin situation is that, of course, they had to have everything with them. They couldn't rely on being resupplied. They couldn't rely on reinforcements coming in. They had to plan and train within this very discrete area, and that's really unusual. And so that I think perhaps what Paul's question sort of alludes to is understanding some of these behind the scenes type things should be quite interesting reading for the audience. That's the hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in your style, you do bring it alive. I mean, some subjects can be quite dry. Logistics is never perhaps the most exciting subject for people. They want more the tanks and the fighting and stuff like that. But without that, nothing happens. And Berlin is a great example of how key that is, keeping those corridors open, whether they're air or land or rail corridors, and how long they can sustain if they're cut off.
Yeah, in the new book, I talk a lot about the transit, because that's, as you say, it's core to the garrison. Everybody would have either driven across, or come on the duty train, or flown into Tempelhof. That's just the nature of the beast. And I, again, lucked out by finding a guy who used to work in the RTO, the Rail Transit Office, Rail Transportation Office, in the 60s. And he was a really good photographer as well. And he took some amazing pictures of Berlin. I've got pictures of the what do they call them? The American version of Operation Rocking Horse, where they basically do an emergency deployment out of barracks to various places. I've got all photos of these emergency deployments, and also demonstrations, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and also lots of pictures of the rail transportation stuff. But of course, each and every transit of the rail and road corridor was a potential flashpoint. So they had to plan for a potential confrontation, and they had to have the communications, they had to have the resources to cope with that. So, yeah, even a boring old train journey is an interesting Cold War story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I did that interview with General Sir Robert Corbett, and his first train journey was particularly interesting. Now, Andrew, we've got one last question. So Madeleine has asked, has the world's view of the Cold War changed since you've been working on it? Has you or the world's view of the Cold War changed since you've been working on it?
Yes, in the sense that the Cold War is a lot more relevant than I thought it was. I thought it was it was in my a chunk of it was in my lifetime, which is obviously why I find it quite interesting. But obviously, what's going on across in Ukraine at the moment, and Putin's role in that, and Putin's role as a KGB officer in Dresden at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and therefore his complete his training, his methodology to become a KGB officer. Once a Chekist, always a Chekist, they say. So it's very relevant. And there's something else also. Robert Corbett, you mentioned, he was kind enough to write the foreword for Secrets of the Cold War. He's a lovely chap. I met him down here in Cornwall. He came down with his wife, and he took us out for a drink. But he's a really fascinating bloke to talk to, as per your thing. And also Major General Peter Williams, who's the chairman of the Bricksmiths Association. He's a big supporter of mine. And I've spoken to them, both of them, about Ukraine and how one of the interesting things was back in the Cold War, there were things in place through the military missions to have a very high level dialogue direct with the Soviet opposite number. So you had, the commander in chief of the GSFG, the Group of Soviet Forces Germany, talking directly to the commander in chief of the BAOR, RAF Germany, US, and the French armies as well. And that dialogue helped diffuse a lot of situations before they sort of elevated to a sort of political level where all sorts of things can then happen. Now, that dialogue was maintained throughout the Cold War, and it was maintained up until certainly the early 1990s. That dialogue now doesn't exist. There's no mechanism to have that same dialogue. And so, you've got lessons that were made in the Cold War that haven't been carried forward into the modern geopolitical environment, if you like. So certainly I think the Cold War is very relevant. Certainly looking back at how Stalin and his successors approached their worldview, if you like, has a lot of bearings on today's geopolitical strife, if you like. So, yeah, I think it's important to understand these stories because they are relevant, and solutions and approaches that were taken back in the day. That basically the Cold War was, luckily didn't go hot. Yes, there was a lot of regional conflict, but the big conflict was avoided through all kinds of different means. And I think that obviously lessons need to be learnt in today's situation. So yeah, it's all very relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Kept the Cold War cold, though.
Yeah,
some
exactly.
of those organisations that you mentioned there. Well, Andrew, I just want to say thank you for coming on this first Meet the Guests episode for our financial supporters of Cold War Conversations. Really appreciate it, and look forward to working with you again on another episode or two.
Yeah, no, I'd be very happy to talk to you guys, and hello all of you listeners. Thank you for that, and thank you for supporting the podcast and keeping the Cold War conversation going. It's obviously you can tell I'm a big fan of the podcast, but also of the subject area, and I enjoy listening to and learning from every podcast I listen to, every episode I listen to, I learn more. So I enjoy it.